Hello, I'm Jim Brown with a little amateur video about my old Searunner Trimaran Scrimshaw. I've had the boat for a long time, built her 33 years ago. I've had plenty of time to monkey around with her gadgets and gillhickeys, and many of her features have been of interest to other sailors, particularly things like her cockpit awning and dodger system and how that integrates with the rest of the boat, her outboard motor bracket and her outboard kick-up rudder. Also, many features of her interiors and her fittings, her outfitting and controls. So I'll try to detail much of that and hope that it'll be of interest to someone down the line as part of our VACA project to preserve multi-hull history. I think it's time to record something of the logic and the love that has gone into creating this oldie but goodie woody Scrimshaw. Here we go.
First, let's have a look at Scrimshaw's cockpit dodger and awning combination. There's a view of the cockpit in the wide open condition. Of course, she can be sailed with nothing in the way. There's the dodger. Looks normal enough, eh? But let's just say you're sailing in rain or spray and you're coming into crowded waters and you really need to see where you're going. You can just grab that thing and push on it, and the next thing you know, you've got 360-degree visibility. You're wide open. Of course, when the dodger is down, the dog can sleep on it. But the big thing is that you've got moving air in the cockpit while having dinner. And of course, sailing under the awning with the dodger down is really delightful on a mild day. And you can really see where you're going.
My navigation is totally shot.
The top of the dodger has to clear the boom by enough room to allow the awning to fly in that clearance eventually. And the dodger zips onto its hoop frame, the usual hoop-on-hoop dodger frame, but the whole thing is spring-loaded.
Now, the really unique feature of the dodger, of course, is this through-deck block with the bungee inside and the bungee that leads up to fasten to the dodger in this position.
The bungee just hooks into that piece of blue nylon webbing that fastens to the hoop by way of a hose clamp. And the side of the dodger just wraps over the bungee with a Velcro flap.
But here's the bungee coming out of this deck block, and it has to go all the way forward to here in order for the dodger to fold down. So that's a lot of scope in the bungee. And that's why it has to go down under the deck and forward up into the forward cabin, some 6 feet forward of the deck block, in order to provide enough scope in the bungee. And this is a little combing that gets fastened around the bottom of the dodger, and it goes right behind the mast and comes along here. And this thing is made out of 2 layers of 1/2-inch plywood, and it's in segments, and it is cut to this curve with the proper angle on the front of it, and very carefully epoxified in segments and fastened down to the deck with mastic, and very carefully sealed so that it won't rot. It's very important to seal up the fasteners very carefully when installing them. The block needs to be located at a specific angle from vertical to get the bungee to lead fair when the dodger goes into the down position. And the same thing for the terminals here. There has to be angled blocks underneath these pedestals in order to get the dodger hoop to pivot down and forward. That's where everything has to line up in order for the dodger to activate around these axes, which are slightly angled.
And the hoop just catches behind that cleat on the mast to hold it positively down.
These zippers for the outside window, I often leave the first 2 or 3 snaps loose and the zipper loose, because it makes it easier to fold the Dodger up and down.
Both the bottom and the top of the vinyl window must have at least a 2-inch wide apron of fabric in order to allow it to compress and wrinkle when the window goes down. And here's the forward hatch flap. Notice that it has a weighted foot and a batten and a plastic pipe across the top. And that thing is very useful when maintaining privacy in the forward cabin. You can duck in and out, but close it completely to keep it dark and quiet when people are trying to rest while at sea. Now there's the forward hatch flap in the rolled up and stow position with the Dodger up. However, with the Dodger in the down position, the flap serves yet another purpose.
The hatch flap comes out from underneath it and can be folded up over it like so and tucked behind the top hoop and underneath the mast cleat. So there the Dodger is in the stow down position, covered and protected by the hatch flap, so that coming and going through the hatch does not damage the isinglass. The first line of defense for the cockpit, in the event that one does not have a Dodger, is the after hatch flap. That thing can be used to close the opening quickly and allow one to duck in and out, even if spray is flying from the windward quarter. If you don't have a Dodger, that spray will jump right down the hatch and into the main accommodation.
Now this is the after hatch flap, but it's much like the forward one.
It's got a piece of aluminum rod. I think it's 3/4 inch aluminum rod in the foot hem. There's some rubber padding wrapped around the ends of the rod so that it doesn't clunk when you drop it down onto the bulkhead. And it normally absolves one of contending with the drop boards. So the drop boards are still necessary, but only in storm conditions or when you want to lock the boat up.
At sea in heavy weather, you may want to put in the bottom drop board, but you can still get in and out of the hatch flap.
There we are with the after flap rolled up and the hatch open. And of course, the second line of defense is the pop-up Dodger itself. In order to release it from this cleat on the mast, which simply holds it down, you have to grab the hoop and pull back hard and get it out from underneath the cleat, and up she comes. Now the headsail furling line comes through the front of the Dodger by way of this reinforced opening, snubs around this winch, passes through this cam action cleat, and furthermore comes down into the cockpit bin to make up around that horn type cleat. That's critical. That'll make darn certain that the headsail will never come unfurled on you when you don't want it to.
Okay, let's talk about the awning with its forward shade fly and side flaps. This thing is not simple. It's made out of 2 layers of sunbrella with a layer of Reflectix insulation in between. It's like bubble wrap, but it's aluminum foil, and you can get dark black shade inside of this thing. The side flaps can be folded down and tied down. They also have a little peek hole in them so that from inside you can see out, even though there's no window to let the sun in, and the side flaps do tie out to the lifeline stanchions. The geometry of the flap has to agree with the position of the stanchions, and the holes in the stanchions have to be very carefully eased in order to prevent cutting the line, both the lifeline and the tie down. Here's the after hoop for the awning. It can be folded down just like the Dodger so that the whole cockpit is left entirely clean, if indeed you want to go racing or some such. And here's the hoop. It folds up and is held with one strut like so. And the pedestals, just like in the case of the Dodger up forward, these pedestals have angled blocks underneath them to permit the after hoop to fold down, angled hardwood blocks. The awning attaches to the after hoop with a zipper and rolls out on top of the Dodger for setup, and the side flaps can be rolled up with the awning, but they also zip off. And note that there is a plastic pipe in the leading edge hem of the awning, and that is led forward and tied around the main shroud rollers. You make the first side up just snug, and then to get the second side tight, you start with both ends of the lashing and go around the roller. One end goes down through the grommet, the other end goes up through the grommet, so you can get a hold of both ends and pull hard forward in order to really get the awning tight. The final lashing looks something like this, and even though the corner is heavily reinforced with several layers of cloth, I don't think I would use a grommet here. Next time I'd use a D-ring because there's a lot of stress on this. At the after edge, there's actually a through bolt fastening for the awning. And note that all of the edges of the awning and the side flaps are cut with slight hollows in them, hollow scallops, so as to prevent flogging in the wind. You can get the awning good and tight this way, but it's still going to sag enough to puddle in the middle, and so it has to be fitted with a ridge pole. And here's the ridge pole. It's just a piece of light aluminum tube that has holes drilled through both walls at both ends. And that thing gets slid up underneath the awning but over the top of the Dodger, and push it far enough forward so that it comes out at the leading edge. At the forward edge it looks like this alongside the mast, and that gives you enough room back aft to get the end of it through that oblong hole, and it goes over the hoop. It goes over the metal hoop like so, and it also goes over that zipper underneath, which will be used later for the cockpit mosquito screen. And up forward you can slide it through the oblong hole and over the plastic pipe in the hem, and there's a line there that ties around the plastic pipe and goes through the holes in the ridge pole and up through an eye on the gooseneck of the boom. You can reeve it through there and pull on that in order to elevate the ridge pole by pulling on the plastic pipe and not the ridge pole itself. So there's the ridge pole from underneath, and it will hold the awning up and prevent it from puddling and from flogging in the wind. Getting in and out of the cockpit requires ducking under the awning, like so. And once you're in here, it's not full standing headroom. You can't stand erect, but you can walk around. And there's plenty of sitting headroom under the awning. And I'm 6'3". Of course, the awning's after hoop must be arranged with the boom so as that the two can clear each other, allowing you to keep the awning erected while sailing. To achieve this may require recutting the foot of the mainsail slightly to give enough clearance. And that implies a fixed topping lift so that the boom cannot drop at the outboard end, and a fixed gooseneck on the mast so that the boom cannot slide up and down the usual gooseneck slide. Incidentally, there's a conflict between the lower shroud and the awning, and it tended to chafe there, so we had to put a chafing patch on the awning to prevent that. And furthermore, the lower shroud, notice that it is set on a block of very hard wood, very carefully epoxified and bolted through to its usual doubler inside. It's the same position, it's just an inch farther outboard than it would be in a normal installation. If there's any wind at all, the side flaps have to be tied up on top of the awning by simply crossing over to the opposite shroud and around the ends of the ridge pole.
So this forward shade fly, which fastens along underneath the boom tent there, comes out and ties to the baby stay, and the corners are also tied down, and there's a piece of pipe in the leading edge of it, so it'll take a lot of wind without flogging. And you can easily roll the thing up around this plastic pipe in the leading edge and put it away. Note that the pipe is scalloped forward and that the edges are scalloped hollow. And notice that the shade fly sticks out a long way to shade the transparent portion of the Dodger. When looking forward, it's like having a very long bill on your cap. If you're in the cockpit looking forward, that shade fly takes the glare off of the immediate foredeck so that you can see where you're going, even in very bright conditions. Here's how it looks from inside. And of course, the forward edge of it can be lowered down to the deck in order to throttle the breeze and let in just as much as you want, depending on how hard it's blowing. So you can leave the Dodger down, or even if it's taken off, like at the moment, and still keep the better part of the breeze out of the cockpit to the extent that's desired.
And also, the Dodger can be used in the half-up position, such as is shown here from the outside. If it's a little too breezy in the cockpit, you can pop the Dodger half up and still have plenty of air moving over the top of it in order to ventilate the cockpit while having dinner.
Note that the awning is set well above the Dodger. It takes a very hard wind to bring rain in through this slot. So what that means is that when you're sitting here navigating, looking out through the vinyl window, if there's something you can't quite see because of the distortion in the vinyl, you can always stick your head up here and have a peek outside through clear air without getting rain in the face or spray in the face under most conditions. And when it gets heavy, you can close up this space by dropping the Dodger, dropping the awning down on top of the Dodger. So if you really want to close up that space,
you can release the line that elevates the ridgepole and drop the awning right down on top of the Dodger. Tie the ridgepole down to the mast and tie the side flaps down, and you've got a real fortress in there.
Let's say the rain and spray is coming from this side. This is the windward side. And this side flap is down, and then we generally leave the other one up. And now you can get in and out of the lee side of the cockpit and still have the fortress intact. So there's the fortress on the weather side. The cockpit is completely defended from windward.
Or you can have the whole place wide open together with the shade of the awning. The only thing you're not protected from is bugs.
Ta-da, ta-da. This is the mosquito net in this rather large tote bag. Good heavy tote bag because the mosquito net is heavy. I don't know, it weighs about, 15 pounds or something.
It's because there's a line in the foot of it that's weighted. It's got lead in the line. And there's also a zipper along the top of it that zips all the way around under the awning.
So there you got the red ribbon on top and ready to go in the right direction. So they are standing in the loop.
That's the way to start laying it out.
There it is, laid out, starting from starboard forward, and it goes all the way around the cockpit after the hatch, and it's just a big snake, but it's in a circuit. It's like a big O-ring, and it comes across forward of the Dodger. So you start by untying the sort of tie-dye squeezums that are located all the way around the side. Incidentally, when you're untying this thing, it's then when you begin to appreciate that whoever tied it up tied each one in a nice snug bow so you can get it untied easily. Otherwise, it takes you forever to get the thing open and underway. You start with a red ribbon at the starboard forward corner and go down the side first, not across the front. You go down the side first and continue all the way around in a clockwise direction looking down on the cockpit. Okay, so it's round the corner and across the back.
And now we see why the ridgepole has to leave the zipper exposed at the end.
Okay, so that's the end of that one. And now we're at the port aft corner now. Now with this piece of zipper. And when we get to port forward, we're going to go around the corner with a zipper non-stop and across the front. So here we are ending up at the starboard forward corner, and the net is installed at the zipper anyway. All the way around the bottom we take this weighted line that's got lead in it and just drop it around outside the Dodger, inside some of the fittings, outside some of the other fittings. Just drop it on there. It'll lay down over piles of line pretty well across the after hatch. Again, you got a leak there. If you're going to leak, we got some cheesecloth rags you can stuff in them. And all along, same thing along the port side of the cockpit here. It gives a complete surround of the cockpit for the full dimensions of the awning. And you can come and go through both hatches without having to disturb any mosquito netting. Note that we can tie the side flaps out or tie them down. And furthermore, we can raise the Dodger from inside the mosquito net. So that if it comes on to blow, let's say you've got the bug net up and it comes on to blow, you can pull up the Dodger and tie the side flaps down and be completely protected in the cockpit while retaining bug protection. Okay, so you got the thing tied up all along, and she's ready to go back in the bag. The bag's down here in the corner of the cockpit, and we're going to start there at the port aft corner of the boom tent. That's what goes into the bag first. It would be the loop of that corner that goes in the bag first. And you try to feed both sides of the circuit into the bag at about the same speed. And if you want to make sure that you're not going to lose the red ribbon in the bag, you can tie it to the handle of the tote bag. There's a string on the handle of the tote bag. You tie it on there and you know right where to start. And I wanted an arrangement that would really protect us here in this cockpit. We're getting just old enough so that we realized we were crazy not to do this years ago because it has made a tremendous difference in our use of the boat.
And of course you can have the cockpit any way you want it. You know, the fortress, or plenty of shade, or wide open. And it really is our main saloon. It's the central living space of the boat. But let's talk about these cockpit seats for a minute. The cushions are 2-inch closed cell foam fastened to plywood bottoms that have risers on them that will hold the plywood and the cushion up off of the cockpit structural part of the seat itself. This is the only way to keep the cushions from getting squishy. And note also that the seat overhangs the structural part of the cockpit seat front and drops down to rest on those blocks of wood that are fastened to the bulkheads there. We sometimes cover the vinyl upholstery with a bath mat material. The vinyl is really tough stuff. You can walk on it and it's permanent, but the bath mat needs a rubber backing so it doesn't slip around. And these are our marine quality bean bags. They have sunbrella covers from the bag lady, and they have zippers so that you can remove the covers for washing, or you can get to the liner inside and remove some of the stuffing in order to make the bean bag really fit the space in which it'll be used. They've just made a tremendous difference in the comfort of the cockpit.
And because the cockpit seat fronts overhang the structural part of the seat, there's room underneath the overhang for all the drop boards and the cockpit table. They all fit behind bungee there. And on this side, the motor controls and the self-steering device are protected also by the seat overhang. The cockpit table lives behind the drop boards against the seat front. Table setup is done with a piece of aluminum shower curtain rod and a C-clamp. The aluminum rod is inserted through the hose clamps on the forward edge of the table. The rod is inserted into the handholds in the forward hatch, and then with the C-clamp attached to the tiller,
the leg is fastened with a lashing, and the thing is pretty solid.
Let's not forget that the awning, the after edge of the awning, overlaps the hatch to the after cabin by a lot. There's quite an overlap there. Certainly enough to handle dripping, and as a matter of fact it seems to be enough to handle a light rain. But then when the hatch is closed,
you have a really generous overlap to prevent rain from getting in the after end of the awning into the cockpit.
This thing is also a water catchment right here. Okay, so there's the jug, and there's the tube going up to the little gutter that's formed along the edge of the awning here by the wide hem. You can take it and curl it up and clamp it around a piece of hose and pick up a lot of rainwater right here. Well, we picked up some. That's about a minute in the light rain.
Well, maybe 2 minutes.
Well, there's one more feature of the cockpit and Dodger awning combination I want to show you.
The hammock slings from the mast winches down through the open hatch and up to the outboard end of the boom.
And you can get into some serious napping out here. You're underneath this double insulated awning. It's got the side flaps thrown up on top, so you've got 4 layers of sunbrella and 2 layers of insulation, so you've got black shade in here, huh?
And the best thing is that when the boat rocks, you rock, and furthermore you're up in the breeze and the shade. Well, perhaps that's enough about the whole cockpit arrangement, at least for the time being. We're not done yet. But for the moment, let's go and have a look at Scrimshaw's rudder and motor installation. The outboard mounts on a dead rise bracket. Note that the deep cold molded V in the bottom of the sled. It pins to the hull through this aluminum plate bolted onto the cabin side, and also the other end of the pin goes into another plate at the hull side. The sled is lowered down just to the point where in calm water the tip of the V dead rise just kisses the surface.
So there's the black line on the hull, the black spot on the hull. It goes back to that point, in which case you stuff it into that clam cleat, and that's about the proper running altitude for the outboard motor. And even when the motor is in the down position, the running position, the hull is not only cleated off here, but also here to make sure that you don't drop the motor.
And the hull has to attach to something really solid. Note that this lifeline is very securely fastened to the cabin side. And you also have 4 parts of purchase. the whole arrangement has to be strong enough so that you can get down there and actually walk on the top of the bracket. It has to be that strong.
And there's a big eye bolt here, actually a towing eye that goes through the hull and bolts to a doubler inside. It's a very secure position, very strong. And there's a piece of 1/4 inch cable that is nickel pressed around that eye bolt and goes down around the throat of the engine, just underneath the motor head. And that line cannot be removed without removing this eye bolt. And to do that, or a U-bolt, and in order to do that, you have to get inside the boat in order to remove the nuts.
So there's no lock as such, just wire.
So if you do drop the motor with the lifting haul tackle, it'll stop at the end of this pendant, this wire pendant, and prevent it from going into the water. And that thing is adjusted so that in the maximum down position, as far down as you can put the motor, so with the motor haul slacked out all the way, the motor in the bracket will drop down until this cable becomes tight. And at that point the motor won't drop any further, it won't drop into the water. It would be very rare that you'd have to lower it that much while running. For, say, sailing with the motor on the starboard side being the windward side and the boat is heeling away from the motor, you can still get the motor down in the water while motor sailing. And note that there are a lot of cables leading to the motor, and these cables lead inside the bracket, and the top of the bracket is cut out so as to allow one to reach in and arrange for these umbilical cords that come out of the cockpit area to reach the motor, and there are several of them.
They come out of the hull, are securely fastened up underneath the wing, and lead in over the top of the bracket and then down into it.
One of them is the fuel line. One is the double high tension line direct from the batteries to the starter. This one is other wiring, and there's a quick disconnect on that one because there are many terminals inside the motor. Remember to disconnect it here instead of inside the motor. And then here are the shifting cables for forward, reverse, and throttle. And they go into this side of the motor, and they're pretty stiff. And they're vulnerable to exposure to the sun, so I've wrapped them up with duct tape and goobered them up with stuff there to keep them from being damaged by the sun and salt. Cables don't last forever. If you have difficulty shifting, it may be necessary to take the cables out of the motor, point them up, fasten them on here so they're pointing up, and dribble oil into them while working the shifting lever and throttle lever from the cockpit to get oil down into the cable. I usually run the motor haul up around the secondary winch here, get up on the running board where I can get a good stance and really haul on the bugger. You got to pull pretty hard. It takes 3 hauls like so to get it up. You can work on the propeller while standing on the swim step.
If a line gets tangled in the propeller, you can actually remove the propeller from here to untangle. It will stall the engine without doing any damage, and you can get back underway. Now these are calm conditions, but you can see that the V-bottom dead rise in the bracket will part the waves to protect the motor from inundation without pounding. And this works even in a steep chop. Okay, let's have a look at Scrimshaw's outboard kick-up rudder. It's a grand and a glorious thing, and boy, if that ain't a Georgia O'Keeffe, I don't know what is.
This skeg, this much of it, swings down to lodge in that trunk.
And when she swings down, part way, the rudder will still steer so that you can navigate into very shallow water. However, when you pull the rudder all the way down, that thing draws about 4 feet of water, and believe me, it has a lot of authority over the direction of the boat.
And then this is the axis along which the rudder actually articulates, because the skeg is fixed. The skeg does not articulate in the steering operation. The rudder and the skeg are both exposed underwater from this point down.
And note that part of the blade area is forward of the axis, giving a so-called balanced rudder.
Note that the steering cables run through the same blocks that were used in the original steering system inside the transom. They just moved out, and they come over to a small quadrant on the rudder. And that quadrant has to be located as close as possible to the pivot pin. Here's the pivot pin for the skeg, the point around which the rudder kicks up.
So that the rudder will steer in the half up position, and it'll pull all the way up without binding in the cables.
For pulling the rudder up, you can just grab the line and haul on it, and it'll come up part way until its buoyancy is starting to come out of the water. And then you need at least two turns on this winch and through that cleat. And I get the winch handle out. You can pull it up by hand. So I get the winch handle out and crank it all the way up.
It's all done from the cockpit.
But when I leave the boat, I don't leave it in this clamp cleat. Again, to make sure that the rudder isn't going to drop by itself, I take it over here and secure it around this cleat. This is the quick release cleat for the rudder, so that if it strikes an obstacle, it can kick up by itself. It's a clam type cleat, and there's a hole drilled through the bottom of it here that's something less than the diameter of the line, so that if the rudder does strike an obstacle and this line pulls very hard, it'll draw it down into the cleat and then out through the hole that's been drilled, so that it'll release itself to prevent damaging the rudder. And the same arrangement applies to the centerboard. The centerboard, haul down, releases in the same manner. So that little projection on the side of the rudder down there is a step, so that swimmers can get their toes on something in order to elevate themselves up sufficient to then climb up the swim steps. So before going swimming, put the rudder down so you can climb out. That whole thing is so big relative to the rest of the boat, but what I was trying to get is I don't want to have control. I want the self-steering device to have control.
There's just nothing like being able to kick back and relax. Joanna can keep an eye on where we're going, and of course the dog can occupy my seat in the cockpit, and I can play around with the video camera while this little power sipping autopilot is guiding us along.
The tiller pilot, shown here, has a hole in the end of its ram, into which one drops the pin on the end of this little crane that's fastened to the tiller. The cockpit wasn't wide enough to run this tiller pilot in the existing width, and so had to set it back in there a bit and overset it on the rudder over there a bit.
There's the custom machine tiller head fitting, the tiller itself, and the crane that clamps to the tiller, and the pin in the end of the crane which engages the ram on the self-steering device.
And the tiller pilot lives in its own recess set into the cockpit seat front. Can be brought out and connected to the tiller very easily, and it's hardwired into the boat's electrical system so as to avoid the usual problems with the cockpit plug-in for tiller pilots.
There she is in operation.
it gives the cruising sailor an opportunity to almost completely escape the tyranny aspect of helmsmanship.
Now that thing has guided us many a gentle mile when you don't have to be there on the helm, but we also know that it'll control the boat with a tight course downwind at surfing speeds in the mid-teens while using very little electricity. Let's run around the cockpit and briefly review the controls. Over there on the starboard side, we have the primary headsail winch with its quick release cleat, the outboard motor uphaul, the main sheet winch, and over on the port side we have the outboard rudder uphaul and downhaul and the other primary winch. Then the secondary winches for boom vangs and spinnaker sheets, and the roller furling line comes into the cockpit, of course. The mast winches are accessible from the cockpit with the Dodger down, and here are the centerboard uphaul and downhaul down here on the cockpit sole. There are the instruments with compasses on both sides, and the engine controls, and then the engine starting switch is in this cockpit bin, and the other switches for electrical controls, the primary switch for isolating the battery plus the mast light switches are accessible by just reaching in from the cockpit. And then even the running backstay levers, while seldom used, are accessible without leaving the cockpit.
Well, there's no doubt that Scrimshaw has enough strings and knobs and levers to satisfy a discerning sailor. And it's a whole lot of fun to learn to sail the thing, especially by yourself. Yet she was not expressly designed as a single-hander. She was intended for family cruising. But even then, there are many occasions when one wants to be able to manage the vessel alone so that he doesn't have to get somebody up out of a dry bunk to help him.
And of course you can have the cockpit wide open, to reiterate. You can also have it well shaded and well screened, and you can have the fortress.
Let's talk for a minute about one more feature of this Dodger and Awning combination: reverse ventilation. With the Dodger in the up position and the side flaps down, even the slightest breeze will create a vacuum in the cockpit, which draws air in through the stern castle window. Yeah, it's great to listen to old Joni singing in Spanish. And sit here in the stern castle with a nice breeze in your face. It's coming through the stern castle window and headed for the cockpit. Cooking vapors get sucked out immediately. The same thing is true if the foredeck hatch into the head is open. Even a light breeze in the anchorage will draw a nice draft through the forward cabin and into the vacuum in the cockpit and on out. If it gets to be too breezy, too much wind coming through here, starting to blow the fire out on the stove and so on, you can take out the prop. It's just a piece of bent aluminum. Drop it on the deck outside and let the window down. Now you've got a real throttle on it. You can let it down to various degrees if you want to, but you got a real throttle on this, the amount of air that's coming in through the stern castle. And if it gets to be really too much, you can reach out here and grab this flap.
This is how the flap or baffle looks from outside on the stern deck.
And now you got some more throttling on the wind here. This is the condition in which you leave the boat when she's on a mooring and you're expecting, you know, weather. Close this thing by just pulling it to and putting the wing nuts on these 3 wing nuts across the bottom here. That's the way to leave. That's the way to really close the boat up, you know. And this stern castle window is strong enough to take green water from the stern.
And while we're down here, let's have a look through the interiors. This view is taken from outside, looking in through the stern castle window and on through the cockpit and into the forward cabin. And this view is taken from up forward in the head, looking aft through the dressing room and through the cockpit and back out through the stern castle window. The forward sleeping cabin, there's the dressing room in its usual state of controlled squalor.
Way up in the bow, there's a sail bin and stowage hold for the garden sprayer shower, and a shower curtain to cover that hold. But let's start here at the real business end. Yes, indeed, Scrimshaw does have a bucket head, for all the right reasons, in my view.
Primarily, it's just very difficult to plug it up.
In this case, it's easy to empty out through the forward hatch without going on deck.
These are the bunks in the forward sleeping cabin. There is sitting headroom here, but they're narrow on purpose. Your feet fit down underneath the cockpit seats, and it's hard to fall out of these bunks. Looking forward from the stern castle again and through the galley, we're down into the double bunk in the stern castle. The galley counter on the starboard side has the sink and plenty of stowage adjacent. Both salt and fresh water are delivered to the sink, and the seawater pump is a 1-inch diameter diaphragm pump so that you can really blast the dirt off of the dishes. But you have to watch out for that sink drain. It'll swallow a Mexican lime or a teaspoon. Fresh water is delivered by way of a foot pump down on the floor to leave both hands free for washing dishes. And on the port side, we have the sink and more counter space. There's actually a great deal of counter space for a boat this size because there are counters on both sides with stowage over and around and under the counters. There's the clock and the barometer in the galley. And the cutting board lives in keepers against the bulkhead, but it lifts out to fit into the sink opening to fit flush with the countertop in order to further extend counter space. There are a couple of utensil drawers, and on the port side you can actually hang up the hot water tea kettle. A whole kettle full of hot water will hang securely on the bulkhead. Table for two, please, in the corner.
And incidentally, when you pull the table out to full length, this space will seat 4 persons. It's cozy, but the table is still strong enough to fall on or sit on at its outboard end. No leg in the way underneath. And when dinner's over, you can slide the table back one seat folded up, the other folded down, the bedding in the back ready to pull out to make a double bunk over this space over the top of the icebox.
It'll keep ice in the tropics for 4 or 5 days. And there are stowage bins on each side of the icebox. And speaking of stowage bins, let's run through the sequence here. There are 2 big deep holes just forward of the galley underneath the cockpit for bulk stores. Up in the forward cabin there are 2 deep holes that go down on each side of the centerboard trunk for heavy stuff, extra water, tools, and spare parts. There's a nice hold underneath the dressing room and lots of bins in the dressing room, a hand basin, another drawer. There are also bins for linens and bedding in the dressing room, and stowage under both of the forward bunks. This one happens to contain the electric panel which lifts out for servicing, a very simple panel. And more storage bins in the after cabin, adjacent to the after bunk, behind the seats for personal clothing. You can really keep things organized if you can remember where they are. And then there's this wide shelf running all the way across underneath the stern castle window. And there's a stowage hold underneath the cockpit for fuel. And then, of course, there are the floats for bosunry. Light, bulky articles. Anyway, we've got stowage.
So there's the after double bunk made up. As you can see, these are big pillows, but it's a tight bunk. Your feet go down there underneath the lazarette. I often use this bunk as a luxurious single, partly because the cabin speakers are right down here. And the stereo is right here at your fingertips. It's actually just a cheap little car stereo with some junk speakers. But the acoustics in this boat are, through no fault of my own, outstanding. I don't know, I've never experienced it anywhere else, and I don't know what it is. But you get the depth of the speakers that are down here in the hull. Together with the shout that comes out of the cockpit. And they seem to combine in sort of a surround sound that I think is quite an acoustical experience.
Unfortunately, the little mic on the camera can't pick it up.
But I'd like to demonstrate the way the sound diminishes when you get away from the cockpit. And if you were to get 20 yards away from this boat in a dinghy, I don't think you could even tell there was a stereo on the boat. The sound seems to be contained by the structure and the Dodger awning and side flap combination. It's all insulated. Here's the ship identification number for the Panama Canal. And here's me in the mirror looking at the little spiel from Sail magazine with Scrimshaw among the 100 greatest yachts in America. Okay, enough already. That's probably more than you ever wanted to know about Jim Brown's old boat. And after all, what's our purpose here? Well, the ancient multi-hulls were arguably the first real seafaring vessels known to mankind. And yet our modern counterparts are not old enough to be historic in the curatorial sense. There's just no doubt in my mind that multi-hulls are to become increasingly important to humankind in the future. Their safety, their utility, their efficiency, and their beauty are all factors that are going to accrue in their favor as time continues. It's been only about 50 years since the advent of our modern, that is, lightweight multi-hulls. And today, June 21st, 2005, just happens to be Scrimshaw's birthday. She's been around for 33 of those years. And in that respect, at least, she may be significant. And there's a lot more to say about Scrimshaw. Her outfitting, her operation, sailing the thing. And yet I'm afraid that in order to include those, we're going to have to go on to yet another DVD. And so the the devotees among you are invited to stick around, but I would understand completely if you would prefer to go sailing. That's where we're going, me and Scrimshaw, on the next disc, okay? In the meantime, I'm Jim Brown, wishing you and Scrimshaw fair wind.